Is the rivalry of the world's two most populous countries reason for global concern? India has complained that Chinese infrastructure and influence are encircling the country. So is China encroaching on India's backyard? Or did Delhi drop the ball by leaning into its now strained relationship with Washington? I'm Andrea Sankey, and this is the Newsmakers. It's an incredibly complex relationship between the world's two most populated countries, and it has long been labeled a rivalry. India and China are both proud, leading members of the BRICS alliance, but regional competition between them has been escalating. China has been successfully building on relations with some of India's closest neighbors, including Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, the Maldives, and Pakistan. And it's not just diplomatic ties, but massive infrastructure projects encompassing waterways, roads, and rail that's been making some in India very nervous. Here's a look.
In the aftermath of the uprising and political overthrow in Bangladesh, a new map of influence is being drawn across South Asia, quietly, structurally, and quickly. Since the ouster of Sheikh Hasina and the installation of the Muhammad Yunus-led interim government, Chinese envoys have moved quickly, holding multiple high-level meetings with Bangladeshi politicians amid a rapid warming of ties and promises of investment. And Bangladesh is just the latest country in South Asia to increase its ties with Beijing. Right across the Indian Ocean, Chinese trade, ports and military links now connect key coastal points, creating a strategic network around India. At the western end lies Pakistan, New Delhi's arch-rival and Beijing's staunchest partner in South Asia. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor has expanded Chinese access to the Arabian Sea, while Beijing is also Islamabad's principal arms supplier.
So we've always been trying to help Chinese positions. Wherever I go in the world, my first position is to respect China, give it what it is, the respect of the world it deserves for its people, for its technology, for everything.
Further south lies Sri Lanka's Hambantota port, built with Chinese loans and later leased to a Chinese state company after running into financial difficulties. Critics warn such deals can lead to debt traps while creating strategic footholds for China. In the nearby Maldives, Chinese investment and construction has been welcomed by leaders promising to distance themselves from Indian influence. And to the north of India, China's presence is no less consequential. Nepal has joined China's Belt and Road projects and works with Beijing on hydropower. Taken together, China's increasing diplomatic, economic and military ties have some in New Delhi warning of an encirclement in what has traditionally been India's sphere of influence.
China is the second largest economy, is a neighbor of South Asia. China is going to be a presence in South Asia. The question is, how do we deal with the Chinese power, economic power, in partnership again with the Japanese, with the Europeans, with Americans? There have been some experiments, not all of them have been successful, but I would say it is a new situation where the rise of China and its impact on South Asia will again produce interesting contrary trends, and the question for India is whether it can ride out those in a way that are beneficial to itself.
The Indian government's reaction to China has been a mix of diplomacy, capacity building and hedging. India has stepped up aid and security cooperation with neighbours, launched high-profile naval patrols and accelerated its own infrastructure and hydro plans. It's also re-engaging with China, as both are in tariff wars with the US. South Asia is no longer just a backwater of great power rivalry. It's now an active stage where infrastructure, finance and weapons shape influence as much as diplomacy. The map has changed, but who will dominate and at what cost?
So how much should the world read into the India-China relationship now? Well, joining me to debate that and more are from Beijing, Senior Fellow at Taihe Institute and founder of Asian Narratives, Einar Tangen. From Perth editor-in-chief of the Journal of Asian Security and International Affairs, Rajat Ganguly, and from Sheffield, UK, senior lecturer in political communications at Nottingham Trent University, Colin Alexander. Thanks all so much for being with me. Rajat, let me start with you. Should India actually be worried about its adversaries, mainly China, building and aligning around India?
Well, I think it's a worry in the sense, not in a very strong military strategic sense. I think nobody in their right minds expects that China is about to attack India, or India would be unprepared, if that were to happen. But I think in terms of India's influence in the region, India's ability to achieve certain outcomes in the region, certainly competition from China, China's presence in the region is a little bit of a worry. I think it is also probably for India a little bit of a worry to have Chinese presence in the maritime domain, in the maritime space around India.
Give us an example, though, Rajat, of what India stands to lose by falling behind in regional influence, if that's what's happening.
Well, if you take Pakistan as an example, then Pakistan effectively became a Chinese satellite state a long time back. But there were other countries where India had a lot of influence, such as in Bangladesh under Hasina, Nepal, before the communist, the Maoist insurgency, the new constitution, the abolition of the monarchy, etc. So India was very strong in Nepal. India has good relations with Bhutan, Maldives, Sri Lanka, etc. But Chinese influence has grown in Nepal, as you know. And after Hasina, the Chinese influence in Bangladesh seems to have grown. There is some talk about China, helping Bangladesh with some, Tista River Basin development, which may also include some kind of an air-based development, very close to a very sensitive part of India called the Siliguri Corridor, which connects mainland India with the northeast. Then, of course, there was, this massive Chinese presence in Sri Lanka during the Rajapaksa era, which didn't go down very well in Delhi. And the same thing happened with the election of Mohammad Muizzi in Maldives, who reached out to China.
He reached out to China and he ran on what was called an India Out campaign. But
India Out campaign.
Yeah.
So,
let me go. Let's before you go too far, let me see what Einar has to say, first of all, about Rajat's analysis there. And tell us also, Einar, what does China get from strengthening relations with Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Maldives? And should India feel threatened by it?
Well, Andrea, I mean, I'm shocked. I mean, India has a U.S. problem, while Washington has its fingerprints all over what happened in Bangladesh and Nepal. They struck this agreement that somehow they're going to be involved to the tune of $500 million in an energy deal with Pakistan and Balochistan, one of the most sensitive areas out there. There's also indications, based on the number of meetings, that the U.S. and Pakistan are under a rapprochement. It is the United States that has pushed 50% tariffs and many more threats against India. It's the United States who has said erroneously, according to Indian sources, that Donald Trump says he settled the war between Pakistan and India, and this is an affront to Modi, who sees himself as a strong man who doesn't need intervention by other entities. So you see all of these things happening, and don't forget also there's been strong suspicion that the United States was involved in the general election where Modi was forced to do a coalition government, and that had some effect. So right now, the problem is not China, but the United States. But I keep hearing that somehow it's all China's fault. Okay. And I find that odd.
Let me ask Colin what you think in that sense. I mean, is it all the United States' fault then? Or is, China is looking after its own interests, which many say India should feel at very least, intimidated by, but also the angle that has India made a mistake by overinvesting in its relationship with the Trump administration in the United States at the expense of its relationship with China and other neighbors?
Well, from a diplomatic theory point of view, it doesn't really matter if you're India or China or anybody else. You've got to sort of play the game that's in front of you. And, I partly agree with the sentiment that India may well have over-egged it with the Trump administration. But ultimately, it's not for India to say who the president of the United States is. And the United States still remains the key superpower on the planet. So I'm not so much buying that. I think one of the things to say here is that India and China are both, emerging superpowers. They are, but also both rising powers as well, and their sort of 4 or 5 pillars of their foreign policy overlap a lot, particularly in terms of regional influence and in terms of securing the vital resources that their continuing infrastructure development requires. And that, by default, then brings them into competition with each other. And also, given that they are neighbours and operating in a very sort of tightly packed Asia-Pacific and Indian Ocean zone, there's inevitably going to be conflict. And you look at the instance of the Maldives, people running on sort of anti-India tickets, but there's also a lot of concern in other parts of the global south around the influence of China over the internal affairs of countries. Okay. So there just seems to me there's a danger of seeing this in zero-sum terms, but actually, this is a non-zero-sum equation. There is these countries have the capacity to have relations with both, and
right.
and for that to flourish.
But let me ask Rajat, because there is the argument that India leaned into its Washington relationship. I mean, Colin, the earlier part of his answer, was saying it wasn't up to India who the United States chose as president, but at the same time, there are those who say that there's a little bit of ideological alignment with the nationalism between the BJP and being a Hindu nationalist party, as some would call it, and versus Trump's sense of nationalism in the United States, and that is why India felt more ideologically aligned with the United States in this case, which was, in hindsight, maybe a mistake.
No, it's a fair question, and what I would say is two broad things. One is, one should not look at just the current reality. I mean, you have to look at India and China and India and the United States in a slightly broader context. It is undoubtedly true that India and China right now have a situation facing both countries where some kind of rapprochement, some kind of accommodation probably is in the best interest of both, and I wouldn't be surprised if that kind of thing happens. We already know that Mr. Modi reached out to China. Air services with China have restarted. The border question probably is now a bit more settled, or at least we don't have the serious kind of problems as we had in around Galwan and what happened after Galwan. But by that token, it hasn't actually gone away. So those things are still there. For the moment, they are a little bit hidden under the carpet, because right now, given the situation in the world, it makes sense for India and China to reach out to each other. And so that's there. But I think if you have to look at the relationship in a slightly broader context, then India's main competitor in Asia, at least, is China. I mean, there's no doubt about it. And if you ask people in Delhi, they would say that our number one strategic rival happens to be the Chinese. Okay. Now, this does not mean that India doesn't have problems with the United States. I mean, if you look at Indian foreign policy after the end of the Cold War, Indian foreign policy basically rested, in my judgment, on two major axes. One was we will maintain strategic autonomy, which means we will decide what's good for us. And the other thing was that we will move away from non-alignment to something called polyalignment, which means we will have good ties, very close ties with many different countries, and United States was one of them.
Okay.
Part of the reasoning also was strategic, that India lost, or at least for the moment after the Cold War, didn't have the Russians as a very stable supplier of military weapons. So had to reach out to the United States, had to reach out to France, had to reach out to Israel. So I think you need to look at it in a slightly broader context, that it's not zero sum, that some.
But also in that context, Einar, I'll ask you, isn't there just a reality here that India can't really compete with China? Given that Beijing is the investor and has the resources to invest in countries like Pakistan, like Sri Lanka. There is no chance for India to do that. Go ahead, Einar. Let me allow Einar to get in quickly. Go ahead.
Okay. Andrea, I think there's a mistake here. There are two views of the world: zero sum, or make the pie bigger. China chooses to embrace the second one. The colonial attitude for those last 600 years is that any competitor is an enemy. In Asia, the fact is competitors can be cooperators. So if you go from competition to cooperation, India and China have so much in common. In 2013, Xi Jinping reached out and he said, look, the fate of Asia and the world, because even at that time, the wealth and manufacturing was moving to Asia. India and China's relationship will define the world. And that's still true. And from Beijing's point of view, they say, yes, we understand that you're concerned about our economic rise, but there has been no political accompaniment. There's no ideology. No one in Beijing is saying that India needs to be more like Beijing. They say each country has its own path. And that's the whole basis of its security, development, civilization, and global governance initiatives. That we're past this point where you start trying to impose things on other people. And you have to get past this kind of Stockholm syndrome idea that the past 600 years are going to be the reality forever.
Okay.
These are civilization.
Let me ask Rajat, though, quickly, if it's that simple, because there have been border skirmishes, wars were fought back in the 1960s, but there's more to this so-called rivalry, if that's too trivial a term. What else is really happening here?
No, absolutely. And to take the point further, I would say that even Mr. Modi has acknowledged that India-China share civilizational ties, historic civilizational ties. Nobody is denying that. But what I think the Indians are worried about is Chinese particular behavior, particularly around the border, particularly, Chinese, influence peddling in places like Nepal, places like Maldives, places like Sri Lanka, Chinese naval activity in the Indian Ocean region, et cetera, et cetera. And not to mention Pakistan, and now in the last few days, you may have seen that, India is reaching out to the Taliban. And many are interpreting that as India's move to counter the United States and China in Afghanistan. So India as a great power or as a would-be great power, whether you like it or not, is in competition with other great powers for influence, for its own vision. And I don't think anybody in India believes that the colonial mindset is, that we have to impose our vision on everybody, or countries should not be sovereign and autonomous to decide their own course of action. All that is fine, but on the other hand, it is undoubtedly true that throughout India's history, India has felt a deep sense of betrayal by Chinese behavior. And you can go back to the 1950s, you can go back to that 62 war, you can go back to these border skirmishes, unilateral moves by China to change the status quo on the border, et cetera, et cetera. None of these things actually create trust in the relationship. And it is very common in India, therefore, for people to say that we have a trust deficit with China. and it'll be up to China to actually,
Okay.
create that trust in that relationship.
Hey, Colin, I can see you smirking. Why?
Well, but I mean, I don't actually disagree with what you're saying, but equally, I think that from the Chinese perspective, they would say quite similar in terms of there being a trust deficit with India, etc. So, India and China actually have a lot that, as both guests have said, they have quite a lot in common, and particularly around their sort of internal or near abroad security issues. China with Tibet and Xinjiang and Taiwan, most notably. India with Kashmir, etc. So, they come to the table with the same kind of anxieties. But I think that we're talking about zero-sum and non-zero-sum issues. In the realm of trade and security, it's probably more of a non-zero-sum situation. However, when it comes to the communication environment, where I spend my time doing research, there is more of a zero-sum situation here, particularly in terms of public opinion. And in both India and in China, we do see the rising narrative of, in India, China being a threat, and China, India being a threat, and quite a lot of sort of anti-India and anti-China narratives that are going along with this.
Einar, it's easy to say we have so much to gain from better relations and we should all get along. But then you have these issues, security issues in particular, whereby, for example, India's cooperation with the Quad, which is actually a defense organization with several other countries, to somewhat try to isolate China. So there are major strategic issues involved that complicate this relationship. Even if you think it's in everyone's benefit to ignore those, they are there.
Well, I'm not trying to be Pollyannish here. I mean, the fact is that China's rise, because it's become so strong, is an issue for a lot of countries. But this idea that you turn to the West, the very colonializers who put you in this position. Remember, India was 24% of the world's GDP before the British came, 4% afterwards. To turn to them and say, well, you should arm us and we should be in league with you against China. Does India not forget that it was the opium grown in India that was used to subject China to 100 years of humiliation? I mean, the days of when divide and conquer should be over. There should be a way of doing this, but there is a trust deficit. But I completely disagree with Colin. I'm a couple of weeks ago, I was on 30 different shows, more than 30 different shows in a 2-week period on Indian TV. And I regularly do Chinese TV. In China, India is not mentioned. This idea that it is somehow on the forefront of everybody's mind is complete nonsense. All right. In India, yes, China is a big issue. A lot for this perceived threat. Some of it is just kind of passive aggressive about the fact that India was ahead of China many years ago and now is way behind. But that should not be an impediment. I mean, India should be looking to U.S. for investment. It is close by. In China, if you pay somebody $100 in the United States to do a day's worth of work, in India, you pay $3. In China, you pay $20. India has natural advantages. It has a huge young workforce. All right. These are things that will be necessary in the future and that China, with a declining population, cannot be. So why not look for that cooperation as opposed to trying to figure out and making all these stale old arguments that, no, we can never get along because China owes us something. Okay. China doesn't owe India anything. India doesn't owe China anything.
Let me
just make a quick point.
Very quick.
Okay. My university is deeply entwined with Chinese students, and, we receive lots of Chinese students. And in my conversations with them, I say to them, what's your perception of the world? Like, who do you like and dislike? And most of them will say that they have apprehensions around India and say that China doesn't like India and we don't like India. So, that narrative comes from somewhere.
When were you last in China? Unbelievable.
I'll tell you what, I'd just like to give Rajat a quick minute for your final thoughts. Hold on. Rajat, go ahead.
I'm actually gobsmacked. I mean, if Colin is saying that British students say that they don't like India, I mean, that's news to
Chinese
me.
students.
I mean, I have, oh, Chinese students. I mean, I have lots of, Chinese students, and I don't particularly get the perception that they actually hate India or they dislike India. I think, I mean, my perception is that India and China have a lot of areas in common. So I agree that yes, these two countries should have good relations, but I think behind any good relation has to be some kind of mutual respect, mutual trust, which unfortunately in India and China's case hasn't developed. Now, it doesn't mean that it won't develop in the future. It could. And as India becomes more powerful economically, militarily, I think eventually India and China will find, common ground and accommodation based on that sort of mutual respect of each other's power.
Okay. All right. Rajat.
But at the same time, I would also say that nobody in India has ever talked about using the West against China. I think that's a complete misreading of India.
Okay.
India has actually never used the West against China, if I can actually say that.
Okay, Rajat, well then that will have to be the final word for this edition of the Newsmakers, because we are completely out of time. So I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us, and our viewers for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on social media, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.